Great. Senator Walker, thank you for taking time to be with us today and just to tell us a little bit about what's been going on with your new change from county council to state senate. And I would love to just hear how are things going for you?
Well, Madam Chair, let me just thank you for having me on this platform and giving me the opportunity to not just sit down with you and talk about what's happening at the State House, but also just to share with fellow Democrats an update and what's happening. And so I'm just grateful for the opportunity and also grateful for your service to the party. I mean, I know it's not easy managing any sort of entity, especially one that's political, but just want to thank you for
thank you.
Your service as well.
Honestly, it's a big job, but it is. I find joy in it because I find meaning in it. So I hope you feel the same about your. It is challenging, but
well, I would say that you're doing very well. You're not just holding up, but you are excelling in the role. And certainly, I know I speak for many members of our Senate Democratic Caucus when I say thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of the party. But as far as my transition to the State House, it's been good for the most part. I will say that it's been a hard pill to swallow, going from Richland County Council where Democrats have control to an environment where Democrats don't have control, where we are a super minority. As it stands right now in the state Senate, we have a total of 46 members. Out of those 46 members, only 12 are Democrats. And so, in essence, we are a super minority, while the Republicans hold a super majority, which means that they hold a veto-proof majority. So they can ram through all sorts of legislation, whether it be from vouchers, for K through 12 public school education, or whether it be tort reform, things that are anathema to many Democrats. They are able to push that legislation through with almost very little resistance or challenge from Democrats.
Yeah. So what has surprised you most about this transition year?
I would say, Madam Chair, the biggest surprise, or I'll answer the question this way. I had my, welcome to the Senate moment during the tort reform debate. On county council, for instance, at the local level, you have to deliver. Government has to work. You have to be able to deliver services or what have you. And so your debates at the local level are often informed and driven by logic. And politics usually takes a back seat. At the State House level, I've discovered that it is the opposite. So while there is a place for logic, I was told by a fellow Republican that, Overture, you're being rational. But we have reached a point in this debate where politics will carry the day. And that was a very hard and bitter pill for me to swallow, especially when you're someone, you don't have any friends to reward, you don't have any enemies to punish. Your goal is just to make sure that we are passing legislation that is in the best interest of South Carolinians, rather than doing what is popular in certain political corners.
Yeah, that's very sobering, and I think that's really important for people who are the voting population or non-voting population, for all South Carolinians to know that that's part of how the sausage is made. But we thank you for your
and I appreciate that. But I would also tell South Carolinians that the only way this is going to change, folks in South Carolina have to say that they are fed up and that they are not happy with conservative governance, in South Carolina. I've been saying now for a couple years that as Democrats we have to figure out a way to turn elections in South Carolina into referenda, on Republican governance.
Yeah.
We've not had control of a single statewide office in nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
Last Democratic governor, I believe was in 2002 with our beloved Governor Hodges. And so we don't control anything. We don't control the levers of power, at the state level. And so the only way this is going to change, South Carolinians have to say they're fed up, but we also have to present them with a viable alternative. We have to show them that Democrats are ready to govern in South Carolina. Now, it may seem impossible to do that because Democrats are not in control. But I think one way we could do it is we begin to highlight a lot of the successes that Democrats are having in areas where we have control, such as like in local government, for instance.
Sure. You mentioned earlier we were going to talk about tort reform, which is not a real exciting subject, but it goes to your point of protecting the best interests of South Carolinians. What is something, I know there's quite a bit going on at the State House, so what is something about tort reform that we might inform the average voter about, and what you would like them to know, and then other subjects too we'll come to?
That's a great question, Madam Chair. So when people hear tort reform, oftentimes they don't know what it is. It sounds like some sort of nebulous or abstract concept. But in essence, what we are talking about is our civil justice system. Here in South Carolina, you often hear about the criminal justice system. If someone commits a crime, that they're to be held accountable, for that crime, and that victims are to be protected. Well, you have a similar arrangement on the civil side. When someone goes out and, perhaps they are driving a vehicle and they're driving recklessly and, crash into a loved one or a family member of yours, or, perhaps you have a product that was defective and that led to a catastrophic injuries. We want to make sure that individuals are protected, that whenever someone has been harmed by the negligence or the recklessness or the indifference of someone else, that there is accountability. That's really what the civil justice is designed for. We don't want folks taken to the streets engaging in vigilante justice when they feel that they've been harmed. And so, and that's why we have our civil justice system that is there to allow injury victims or individuals and even businesses to have their day in court, to have their rights vindicated, and also to seek any sort of redress or remedy, for a wrong that was, heaped upon them, right? And so what the General Assembly did, or at least what the Senate, did, was they decided that they wanted to make changes to our civil justice system, but those changes were designed, or at least were approached from the standpoint of what can we do to protect business, as opposed to what can we do to enhance and protect the rights of injury victims. And many of those injury victims are people that are family members of ours. They're our coworkers. They're aunts, uncles, friends, folks who are just out minding their business, trying to enjoy this democracy that we have, and then there's a mishap, or someone just so happens to harm them. Sometimes it could be simple negligence. Other times it can be intentional. But we want to make sure that we have a civil justice system in place that protects injury victims. And I feel that what we have done with the most recent legislation in the Senate, which I voted against, was we decided to enhance protections for businesses at the expense of recovery rights for injury victims.
Right. So in theory, we should be pro-business, but not at the expense of the average citizen or somebody who's been harmed by.
Absolutely, Madam Chair. And I'll tell you, during the debate, over tort reform or changes to our civil justice system, I was very unequivocal, as far as with my stance, which was I support, and I think as Democrats, we ought to support providing certainty, to businesses. We ought to promote policies and ballyhoo for policies that are going to give businesses certainty and that create jobs, for, the citizens that we serve, sort of jobs that pay a living wage you can raise a family on. But that should not come at the expense of injury victims. Yeah. All right. That should not come at the expense of injury victims. I felt that there was a way that we could reconcile those two interests. They didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Yeah. Some people felt that they were. I felt that they didn't have to be, nor should they be. Yeah. But unfortunately, my position and my approach didn't prevail at the end of the day. Ultimately, logic ran into politics.
Good way to put that. So this bill is now in the House. Is it on? That's correct.
So here's an interesting tidbit. So the House actually beat the Senate to the punch when it came to tort reform. Oh. So while the Senate was debating, Bill S-244, which was tort reform, and S-184, which was liquor liability, the Senate actually passed a bill that addressed what we would call joint and several liability, which is where you have multiple defendants in a case, and if there's one defendant who is 51% at fault, he or she or that entity could be on the hook for an entire judgment. Well, the House addressed that, and the House also passed liquor liability as well. And they sent that bill over to the Senate, and that passed unanimously in the House. Now imagine that you got, Todd Rutherford and Seth Rose voting along with R.J. May, wow. On a bill. That gives you it was a unanimous vote. It's very rare that anything passes out of the House unanimously, and it came to the Senate. And had the Senate taken it up, I'm confident it would have passed almost unanimously in the Senate. But instead, we continued on with the tort reform debate, which took up a month on the Senate calendar, and eventually it passed. And so now the Senate's bill will go to the House. The House has to decide if they're going to take it up. And if they do, most likely it'll go into what they call conference committee, where both chambers will meet and try to hammer out some sort of agreement.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun.
That's the sausage making that you referenced earlier.
Exactly, the politics over logic. Well, so are there other bills that you want people to be aware of, or what's your focus right now?
Well, I would say the bill that I think we ought to be aware of, that is actually, it passed the Senate earlier in session, and it's now over in the House, is the bill that deals with vouchers, private school vouchers at the K through 12 level. Last year, the Supreme Court here in South Carolina, by a razor-thin margin, struck down the Educational Scholarship Act, or the Educational Trust Fund Act. The name escapes me at the moment, but I believe that was passed into law in 2023. And it was challenged in the Supreme Court last year, and by a 3-2 margin, the Supreme Court said that that legislation, or the use of public funds, for private school education, was unconstitutional. Yeah. And so the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court here in South Carolina issued a dissenting opinion in that case, and that dissenting opinion was the playbook, if you will, for this most recent push, by the Republican Senate to actually use public dollars, for private school education at the K through 12 level. And what they've done is rather shrewd. This time around, they have decided to use lottery dollars, to fund these private school vouchers or scholarships for private school education at the K through 12 level. And the argument that they've made is, well, if you support the use of, life scholarship funds, if you support the use of the Palmetto scholarship funds or Hope scholarship funds, if you think that students at Furman University, at Wofford, at Bob Jones, at Converse College, all these private schools around the state, if you believe that those students should have access to those same dollars, which they do now, then why would you be opposed to lottery dollars being used to subsidize or fund private school education at the K through 12 level?
Yeah.
So that was the argument, rather shrewd. I disagreed with it. I took the position that everyone has to apply to go to college, but public school education is free. So that was my position.
Big difference.
But once again, it was not logic that prevailed at the end of the day. It was politics. And then, the lottery right now is running, they're losing money. They're not running a deficit, but they're losing on average annually a little over $40 million.
So the funds
likely wouldn't. So they're losing money, and what the Republicans pass in the Senate, well, that is going to cost, a little over $60 million annually. Wow. And so they're going to draw down $60 million from a revenue source that is already losing $40 million annually. And so I have concerns not only about what it does to public education at the K through 12 level, but also have concerns about the impact it could have on students who are currently in college and who are currently recipients, of the Life Scholarship, for instance, right? And whether or not, if we may find ourselves in a situation of robbing Peter to pay Paul, in the event we have an economic downturn and state revenues are down. And if you look at what's happened in Washington recently, we have a president, who is just unpredictable and fickle when it comes to economic policy. I'm of the opinion he doesn't know what he's doing. He's just shooting from the hip. But when you look at what's happened there with tariffs and the cost of goods going up, that has a trickle-down effect and could potentially impact revenues here, which could potentially impact the amount of revenues that the lottery is able to generate, which then could impact those lottery-based scholarships, such as the Life and the Hope and so on. And we're talking about drawing down additional $60 million annually to fund K through 12 private school education.
There's a lot of irony in that situation of taking money from lottery to fund private vouchers, especially for younger children, but for people who are going to need those funds the most, and it's not an equal system.
Right.
But I also wonder if, what is there something that people can do to be effective in voicing their concerns?
I think folks can certainly reach out to their elected officials, whether it's Democrat or Republican, and tell them that you do not agree with the concept and or the practice of using public funds and specifically lottery dollars, for the purpose of funding K through 12 education at the private school level, right? And in addition to making those calls, at the end of the day, in a democracy, your vote is what is going to make the difference. That is what's going to carry the day. I think, Madam Chair, as Democrats, we have to figure out how do we regain power in this state, or at least get to a point where we are a consequential minority to where we can have an impact on legislation, right? That is what we're going to have to figure out going forward. It's good for people to call their legislator and express their discontent with what's happening, but there are also people who are expressing support, and for this sort of practice, using lottery funds or public dollars to fund vouchers, and those people are pretty active, and they tend to threaten their elected officials with primary challenges if they don't vote a certain way. So they hold their elected officials accountable, even while those, and many of those Republicans, they've told me off the record, they're not, a fan of the practice of using lottery dollars or public funds for private school education. But they understand that they have a pretty rabid base that is politically active who will hold them accountable if they don't support certain legislation.
So I might be hearing you say that we need to do a better job of making a case for why people should call and not vote, but support a more fair system
That's
of
right.
funding.
But I'm also saying, I think as Democrats, we have to begin to think more broadly, if you will, about how political power works in South Carolina. The example about the Education Scholarship Act. It's the perfect, or a good exemplar, if you will. So if you think about it, that bill, or that act rather, was upheld by the Supreme Court. Shot down, by the Supreme Court in 2024. Mm-hmm. But think about why the Republicans have decided to take another shot, at funding private school education in South Carolina with the use of public dollars. Well, because they feel like now they have a favorable Supreme Court. Right. When it was shot down last year, that was a 3-2 margin, and Chief Justice Al Beatty was on the court at the time. Well, because of the mandatory retirement rule that we have, he retired last year, and so Republicans in both the House and Senate, they had a chance to replace him upon his retirement, and so I'm quite sure, when they made that decision to support the new justice, it just wasn't solely based on merit. Yeah. I'm quite sure there was probably something that they saw that they liked with respect to that justice's judicial philosophy. Yeah. So now they feel that they've got a court that is going to be favorable, to this sort of legislation. So my point is, I think as Democrats, is not only about regaining power, but we have to begin to think about the judiciary as well. Mm-hmm. Not only when candidates are running for office, but also when we're voting and thinking about which candidates to support. I think we ought to ask them, what is your stance, on the judiciary? What type of judges would you be inclined to support or vote for in the event you were in the General Assembly? Republicans have understood that for decades now. And I'll just kind of use a sports analogy. In sports, there's this thing called home court advantage. Mm-hmm. And what that means is we're playing on your home court, and the referees are inclined to probably make the calls in your favor. Yeah. Well, in politics, there's a thing also called home court advantage, and that exists at the Supreme Court. That's why you see the fights at the federal level over federal nominees and over Supreme Court justices, because you're hoping to get a court that perhaps tilts one way. And so if there's a challenge to the legislation that you support, your hope is that you've got home court advantage, that those judges are going to uphold the legislation that you were able to pass. Okay. And so that is something I think Democrats have to be. That's long-term strategy, but we have to begin to think about that.
Yeah, duly noting. Being informed not only on issues, but the legislature in South Carolina has the power to promote judges and elect, if I'm saying that correctly.
Absolutely. The way the system works now is both the House and the Senate will vote on judges. You go through a process, called it's the Judicial Merit Screening Committee. That's where judges are vetted. That committee will determine if you are qualified or not qualified. If you're qualified, you're screened out, and then you go to the floor where you have a chance to sort of campaign, if you will, right, and try to earn votes from members of the General Assembly in both chambers, and then eventually we take a vote. In fact, we had judicial elections earlier this year, back in January, late January, early February, I believe it was. But that's the way the process works now. Is that the legislature ultimately, we vote on the judges, but those same candidates, they go through a screening process.
Gotcha. Would you say that they're representative from around the state, or does Columbia have a home court advantage?
No. It's fair and balanced for the most part. Because you have circuits throughout the state, right, and in those circuits there are resident seats, and so in Richland County there are 3 resident seats, and then you have 2 at-large seats, and the at-large seats can go anywhere. It can be you can have someone who lives in Richland County and they run for an at-large seat. And so then if they win, they prevail, they're based here. Or it could be an at-large seat, and someone in Richland County runs, they lose, and maybe it goes to someone who lives in Dorchester County. That's where the seat goes.
Are those seats evenly apportioned, or does it depend on the population of a circuit?
That's a very good question, and I should have the answer to that.
Fine, we can come back to this.
Yeah, so we can certainly come back to that. Yeah. And certainly when I get an answer for you,
okay,
I'll circle back.
It's just a curious question that popped into my head. Well, thank you so much for your time. Are there any other things that you would like people to know about, or things that you would like for an action from the average voter in Richland County and beyond? I
would say it's super important for voters, and especially Democrats, not to lose faith. I think it's super important to remain engaged. I think it is super important to remain optimistic. And I think it's super important to talk with your neighbors, talk with family members. Let them know that democracy is a verb. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be a noun. It's a verb. It requires you to do something. It's not enough to sit at home and complain. There's nothing wrong with complaining and griping, but at some point we have to parlay that discontent into action. And not only does that mean voting, that means calling up your elected officials. That may mean showing up for a rally. That may mean volunteering, phone banking. That may mean giving money to support candidates that you believe in. And for some of you, that may mean offering yourself for public service and running for office or serving on a commission or on a board. And also, it's important to remember that it's not just, you not only have Democratic elected officials at the state level, but you have a lot of Democratic officials who are elected at the local level. There's some great things happening in the city of Columbia. There's some great things happening in Richland County. There are bright spots for Democratic governance here in South Carolina. And so I would just say, keep the faith, remain optimistic, remain engaged. And even for someone like me, who's frustrated at times with just being a junior senator who is part of a party that is a super minority on the General Assembly, I remain encouraged, and I think that we have no place to go but up as a party. But it's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of time to get there, but we're capable. That's
so well said, and you just did my plea for me, so thank you so much. I couldn't have said it better. I really appreciate your service. It is really hard to go from a logic-based system to a political-based system, and I know that can be tiring at times, but I appreciate you keeping up the fight. And maybe the fight's not the best word, but keeping up the hope and the action. So, thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right. Good. That's probably about 20 minutes, but